Welcome everyone, and welcome Shane for joining this podcast. We've been doing a series where we bring on writers in different fields, and what we try to do is to go behind the writing process itself. So today's discussion is not about what you write, but about how you write and how you think about that process. And I'm joined by my co-host DJ here, and she'll introduce herself in a minute. But before that, I just want to introduce Shane to everybody. Looking at the attendee list, my guess is everybody knows Shane, but I'll still go ahead and do an introduction. So Shane is the creator and writer behind Upstream Ag Insights, which is a weekly newsletter about issues related to agriculture and technology and food systems in general. He has been writing online for almost more than 2 years. We'll find out how long. And he has amassed a big following because of the quality of his writing and his analysis. And he never misses a beat. I always expect to see and always see his newsletter in my inbox every Sunday morning. And he's, I think I can say this, he's an inspiration to a lot of us in terms of how he writes and how he is so consistent and maintains a high quality. Doing all of those things is extremely difficult. So welcome, Shane.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I appreciate the introduction, Rhishi. It's really strong praise coming from yourself. You're somebody that I look to as well for great content and inspiration. So happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
So I'll hand it over to DJ, my co-host. We have a set of different conversation topics that we want to go through. So DJ.
Yeah, so quick introduction. I'm DJ McCauley. I'm the science editor for CSA News magazine. So that's Crops, Soils, and Agronomy News. And it's a member benefit publication for 3 different academic societies. So the Agronomy, Crops, and Soil Science Societies of America. So I'm kind of in the same realm, but kind of on the science side. So less about the agribusiness. But I'm super curious, Shane. So when did you know you wanted to be a writer? What does this journey look like for you?
Yeah, it goes way back, actually. And it's interesting you mentioned you're on the science side. That's actually where my writing started, quite frankly, a decade ago, something like that. And I wouldn't say that I ever wanted to be or even claim to be a writer in a lot of ways now. I still feel a little bit strange because to me, writing is more of a learning process for myself. First and foremost is the core priority. But when I really started to write goes back to right around 2011. So about 10 years ago, I was still in university, but it really stemmed from, I was having conversations with farmers about agronomic challenges or issues. And I was really struggling to communicate effectively with them about diamondback moths or whatever disease or insect was coming up. And I was like, how do I actually think beforehand about how to start this conversation, convey it in a way that they're going to understand, that's going to make sense, that's going to help make them take steps to make a decision. And so I started actually writing out one-pagers just for myself. And so I had one-pagers on like 80, 90, I don't even know how many topics, just where I would kind of research and then break it down into these very consistent frameworks of, here's the process of how a diamondback moth emerges, here's the threshold, here's the insecticides, and so all of a sudden it really helped me communicate with customers and farmers and colleagues and all those sorts of things. And it helped me actually really understand my gaps in understanding. And so then I go research some more. And so that was really the inflection point of writing. And then from there, I think there's a lot of interesting points for me kind of within a 2-3 year time frame from a writing perspective is actually all those one-pagers ended up really influencing my career. And I think writing is inextricably tied to my entire career. Even to this day, it's the biggest aspect. But, Rhishi knows this individual, but one of my good friends, Matt, wasn't a good friend at the time. And he comes from a large farm and he reached out to me being like, hey, you know what? I'm trying to learn about agriculture and agronomy. I'm helping out on my dad's farm this year. Can you send me some things that you're reading or thinking about? And so I sent him like these 80 documents, and so that's where one of my really good friendships started because of writing for one, but then also got exposed to his family farm, which is a unique operating farm, and got exposed to just a really business savvy farmer at a really young age. So that was really, really cool, and just how writing tied back into that aspect. But then from there, I was a nerd and just always wanted to talk about agronomy. And so I started really going on Twitter and sharing what I was reading in journal articles. And that really got me exposed to a lot more people, but then also got me exposed to some of the media in Canada, and a prominent media organization. The founder approached me and is like, "Hey, do you want to write something for us?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure. What do you want me to write?" And he's like, "Just pick a topic." And so I started picking topics and writing, and he had, thousands and thousands of readers. And so that got me really exposed to more people. And what that really did was, I would say, is show me the tight feedback loop that writing can give you, where I wrote something, quite frankly, one time that was wrong. I legitimately shared wrong information, and the call it foremost leader in Canadian agriculture on spraying reached out to me, and he's like, "Hey Shane, like, I don't want to, I'm not trying to nitpick here, but this is actually incorrect." And so all of a sudden, I gained a contact with one of the most prominent spray individuals and experts in Canada. And now all of a sudden I had him as a resource because I actually wrote something wrong. And so I think that was kind of encouraging, just because you don't know everything, this can actually turn into a process of self-improvement and getting better. And so that was really important to me. And that was something that was really influential on me there. And even kind of the topics I was writing on, I would read these pieces, and like agronomy, as you know, I didn't realize you were actually in the agronomy side of things, DJ, which is really cool. And agronomy back then, a lot of the stuff I was reading was like, we're going to talk about desiccation, and it was kind of like, here's the staging and here's the product you use, and there wasn't a lot of room for nuance, and because we know farming is very nuanced. There's a lot of factors that need to go on, and nothing is ever perfect. And so what I started to do was take the concepts of, okay, well, here's the staging, here's each product and how it's going to perform. But here, if you run into these constraints, like, hey, you don't want to have 20 gallons of water. Here's the product that might work best, and here's the surfactant to consider applying within it. So I started kind of tying in the other aspects, and that really ended up, I still have some of these articles got like 10,000 views. I don't even get that now sometimes, quite frankly. And so that was really cool, just to really start to share stuff and learn in that way, and force myself to think, well, if I was reading this, what would I want to learn? What would I need to be asking? And so it really helped me just improve in general there. And then even in as I kind of moved forward in my career too, I started writing internally for an organization, and so I started writing to the customers, and all of a sudden I had 250 farmers on a list, getting my emails every single week about agronomic things to think about. And then I moved on to another organization, and I did the same thing, but targeted at the agronomy staff and sales staff internally at the organization. And that helped me network internally. It helped me gain credibility internally. It helped them understand what questions they should be asking and consider to ask. And so, and it helped me improve, quite frankly, because there was, again, times where I'm like, I need to go dig into this more. And so it's just been a huge learning process all the way along. And so if you look at the last 10 years, basically I've written at least every other week, or on average every other week, for 8 out of those 10 years. There was a 2-year gap where I was in some different roles in my career, and I just didn't prioritize it. But then I kind of get to the last couple of years where what Rhishi alluded to is Upstream. And I used to talk specifically about agronomy, but I would always sit there when I was in this role where I wasn't writing, actually, and all this tech information was coming out, and I would try to go to experts in the industry and leaders in the industry. And, there was FBNs coming into Canada, and everyone's like, they're just going to sell farmers data and it's going to be the worst thing ever. And they're not doing anything. And to me, there was always more to it than that. And I was like, I need to better understand what this is. And fast forward to when I started Upstream, I thought, hey, maybe there's an opportunity to learn and meet and people and network, kind of like I did with agronomy, but now kind of fill this small niche within the industry. Kind of, Benedict Evans, who writes a newsletter, is really the one who inspired kind of the approach to Upstream. But really, that's where that's kind of been my writing career, is just trying to learn and trying to figure out how to better support myself first and foremost, but then how does it actually tie into some better learnings and understanding for the industry.
Yeah, so I want to go all the way back to when you were talking about.
Yeah, sorry.
No, you're good. I think it's a really fascinating evolution. So when you were writing these one-pagers, I kind of do this when I start a new article, but were these like internal sort of like note documents for yourself? Like how has your approach shifted as you've gained an audience and you aren't just writing for your own like enlightenment?
Yeah, so like that is how they started. They were just plain and simple. For me, I had no intention of anybody reading them. And in fact, when I would do some other say within work, there would be the odd, newsletter that I had to write for. And I'd say, okay, I'm supposed to write on, I don't know, some herbicide and its efficacy. I probably wrote something adjacent to that, and I would pull that in and then kind of reshuffle it around and then use that for that. So they were definitely targeted at myself and at this very specific, I can't remember the exact framework, to be honest, it was about a decade ago, but it was really targeted at being and having an understanding of, okay, what is this pest, or what is this active ingredient, or what is this specific problem, and then kind of dive into how does it occur, how do you solve it, what are some of the nuances within these approaches to solve it, and so that was really the focus there. As I've shifted to more writing for an audience, I don't know if it's changed a whole lot outside of I actually created this persona. I call him Doug. And so I kind of think about anytime I'm writing something within Upstream now, whether it's identifying topics, whether it's the frameworks I'm applying, everything kind of comes back to this really in-depth persona that I have, which is kind of based on myself in some ways, but then also acknowledging that there's a lot of people outside of myself that are going to be interested. But it's really looking at it from an agribusiness professional perspective. And so when there's news, when there's events, when there's new topics, I'm always thinking about it from this person's perspective, trying to empathize with this individual and thinking, okay, what would they like to know? And again, I've purposely constrained some of the stuff I talk about where I try to focus in on North American ag tech news and events. And anytime there's news outside of that I think has applicability to North America, I try to highlight why is this applicable to North America. But yeah, I have this individual, they have a degree from Purdue, they live in the Midwest US, they work in the mid-management in ag retail, they're in market, they've had experience in agronomy. And so it really just helps me kind of focus in on what do they want to be learning about. And I think the one part that I try to focus in on as well is I kind of have this cynical view of people, I guess, in general, is that people want to be told what to think, not how to think. But I think for the audience of Upstream, it's actually the opposite, that they want to know how to think about the problem or the situation. And so I do my best to provide frameworks where I can, so that it helps people apply that or think about it in a different way. And so I kind of invert my cynical view on how I think, and I don't think that's negative on people. I think we're just humans that want to be efficient and just kind of get to the outcome as fast as possible. But I truly think the Upstream reader tends to be somebody that's differentiated and ambitious and wants to improve. And you don't get that by just getting, here's the answer. You get there by helping them walk through the process of thinking about that specific problem or situation or whatever it might be.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard of the approach of like using kind of an audience of one before to guide developing your voice as a writer, but when did you land on like the name Doug? Like when did you know you needed to figure out there was one person?
Yeah, I actually read a book. Oh man, it's called Little Black Stretchy Pants. It's by Chuck Wilson. He's the ex-CEO but founder of Lululemon, and I read this probably just before starting Upstream actually, and he talked about the Lululemon customer, and they have a persona all the way down to like the birthday of this individual of like who are they targeting, and I was like, hey, you know what, that's kind of an interesting concept, and the book just fascinated me in general and how he thought, and so I stole that idea from him, quite frankly, and have applied it, and it's been, again, there's probably times where it's ineffective because, but to me, the way I look at it is if I can really hit that core individual really, really well, and it's going to resonate, that he or she is going to share that more vigorously, or it's going to kind of expand to be bigger, that it's going to catch these edge cases more consistently. Whereas if I'm trying to write for a venture capitalist, and I'm trying to write for a farmer, and I'm trying to write for a call it tech founder, you're going to miss a couple every time. Instead, I'm just like, hit that one person in the bullseye every single week. And again, I kind of write about a bunch of topics too, so I kind of cheat in a way where one can kind of hit that individual, of course, but I'm not trying to write for a VC. I'm just trying to write for a really ambitious middle management that wants to potentially be in the C-suite or executive or senior leadership role, and so they want to improve, and that's kind of how I go about it.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned that 2 years ago you started your newsletter officially, but what role does that play in your career now? Like, how does it fit in with your work?
Yeah, it basically is my career now, I guess, in a lot of ways. About a year ago right now is I actually I left my employer and didn't have a new job lined up. I had, I don't know, 1,200 subscribers or something like that within Upstream, and just kind of thought to myself, hey, you know what, this is fun for me. I'm going to just explore some learning for a few months and not jump into a new role, but make sure I find a company that is a good fit for me culturally, that I value, all these sorts of things. And lots of opportunities arose, but I actually ended up having quite a few opportunities with advisory and consulting and these sorts of things through Upstream. And so I just kind of stuck with it. And so now Upstream is really what I do every single week to network and learn and use it as a lead generator for my advisory and consulting business. So it really is kind of the foundational aspect of what I do every single day and week, and really feeds any sort of income and experience I gain.
Awesome. Yeah, you cover so much in your newsletter every single week, but what does your research process look like, and where do you get your ideas for what to write about each week?
I don't know if I have a process, unfortunately, but you know, and the ideas are so random. I don't like. I guess I'll start with the process. Is really just actually I'll start with the ideas. I guess probably stem from, I always am trying to consume. Like, how can I? Some people are very anal about what they put into their brain, what they put into their inbox. I think of myself as an information carnivore, where I just like need more information constantly. And so I'm reading every single morning, I'm reading every single evening, and those just tend to kind of coalesce into random thoughts. Like, I'll give you an example of what I wrote this week for next week's Upstream is what ag retail can learn from Switzerland. And super random. There's Brian's there in Switzerland. But anyways, I was watching this video. My girlfriend and I are looking at potentially going to Europe sometime in the future. And so I started watching videos on Switzerland just as an interesting place. And all of a sudden I'm like, that is a fascinating, I'd always been kind of interested in them because they, you know, the Swiss chocolate and the banks and all that are, of course, are cool. But I was watching this video on it, and they just have so many constraints within their country. There's no port. They have kind of this treacherous terrain in general, and yet they're one of the highest GDP producing per capita and in totality globally. And so I'm like, what kind of culture does that country have to be that, to get to that point? So anyways, I took that and was like, maybe I should research this, and then tied that into an article about what are the things that they do from my perspective anyways. And so anyways, the reason for that story is it's just pretty random in terms of try to consume, try to take notes, try to put ideas into a basic document and see what comes of it. So there's kind of just random thoughts there. And then the process is really just as random, where all of a sudden I get that in my head that, hey, you know what, I'm going to try and connect Switzerland to ag retail. And I will end up with like 40 tabs open on my computer screen, and I'm cross-referencing articles on Google Scholar. I'm cross-referencing it with, you know, World Economic Forum, and then trying to tie back into the psychology of it. And so I really am just kind of dumping information into a document, going to pull more information to see if it ties in, and then from there trying to put it into some sort of semi-coherent, semi-valuable piece of writing, I guess, is the process. So it's very random.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect tie-in, because I wanted to ask you about editing. So do you have like a process for editing down that information once you've created your super random document? What does that look like when you go to hit send to all your subscribers?
So I need a better process, quite frankly. You know, right now it basically comes down to myself kind of trying to proofread, and I'm hyper aware now of just how much I miss, because you're reading it, you already thought about it, and so you kind of gloss over some things, and sometimes it's for one, I think there's some embarrassing things that come from it. I've noticed, like, couple weeks ago, Liam Condon, who's the I guess outgoing CEO of Bayer Crop Science, his last name is Condon, and I actually misspelled it condom, and so there was an M in there, and so I had people reaching out to me being like, hey, just so you know, you spelled his name wrong. And that's just basic things that are I should be doing better or be looking at closer. So that's kind of the one where there's just some things from a professional perspective I need to do a better job of. And the second is just from a readability perspective, and this is where I alluded to earlier, where I'm, I don't consider myself a strong writer. I kind of just write how I think. And so I just kind of dump stuff out. And so sometimes I end up with too many words, a lot too many words. And so I'm trying to get better at that and trying to work on that. But that's something I need to do a better job of prioritizing. But right now it's really just kind of read through it. And then sometimes my girlfriend reads it and gives it a skim. And then one of my friends, I share it with him every single Saturday, and he gives it a glance. But I also, I'm writing, or I'm sharing, I shouldn't say I write all of it, but I think on average Upstream has between either a secondary article and the issue itself has 5,000 words. So I can't expect people to prioritize going through that with a fine-tooth comb all the time. And so I've looked at potentially getting an editor, and I see Mark Johnson is on. He actually edited mine once, and that was a good source of humility. That's for sure, when you have somebody read it and give you some of the feedback on it actually as well too. But that's something that I need to improve on, because right now it's just a very half-assed process, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, well, you're talking to the right crew, because the whole premise of Foster is basically utilizing others for editing. But I guess when you look at time constraints and just the sheer volume of writing that you're putting out every week, like, how could you make time to prioritize, I guess, streamlining or editing?
Yeah, and I think that's probably, I think there probably needs to be a trade-off at some point, because right now I would say I'm pretty capped in terms of between the actual other work I do and then writing Upstream, specifically on a week like this week, for example. There's a lot of interesting news and a lot of events kind of coming out, and so all of a sudden you end up with a lot of time writing, and quite frankly I'm biased towards that too, because that's the exciting part to me, is like kind of trying to think through and learn and improve, whereas I view editing as just tedious and painful. And so I need to, again, kind of fall in love more with the outcome of that. But I think for me, it would be moving forward, if I'm going to do it, I need to make the conscious decision to cut back or dial back on a few different topics, and focus more on spending that extra hour or two on editing more specifically, or biting the bullet and hiring an editor. And I've looked at that, whether it's through an Upwork or something along those lines. My timelines are a little bit awkward, is one of the challenges too, just in the sense that I don't typically start writing until Thursday night or Friday, and don't really finish up until Saturday, and then it goes out Sunday morning. And then my goal is to try and have everything completed by Saturday at noon, sort of thing, if possible. And so all of a sudden that only gives that individual, 8 hours or 10 hours to kind of get through it. And so I think in order to really, if I was to really take it serious, I need to prioritize just call it writing it at a different time frame, cutting back on some of the content. So that's something that I need to do a better job of assessing and analyzing.
Yeah, we had a question. We would love to hear more about your research process and what the workflow looks like between research and writing. So as you develop that document, are you writing at the same time, or is it sort of a synthesis at the end?
Sometimes it honestly, it depends. And I think sometimes it really depends on if I have an semi-informed framework beforehand. I'll just give an example because it's fresh, where I was writing about there's some news with two prominent companies this week, and it's in a space that I would say, it's more in the computer science space. It's Microsoft and Bayer. They have an announcement that came out this week that I think is pretty cool, and that is, I would say, outside of my core competency in terms of knowing some of the tech stacks and the tech infrastructure and what that means. And so what I've done with that is more, I kind of dump some random thoughts in, go Google some stuff, send messages to some of my network saying, hey, I'm thinking about it like this. How do you think about it? How would you think about it? Where am I off? And then I kind of let it sit for another, several hours, and then I go research again, put a few more thoughts down, and then usually throughout those messages I send and some of that research, I just kind of try to piece something together. I think people that read Upstream will probably notice it's clunky, and some of that is because of that process. I think is because sometimes I'll kind of have something written fully, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh man, I missed this point, and then I try to work that in because of the time constraint, and so it's a little bit, yeah, clunky might not be the best term, but that's how I think about it. And so yeah, no, it's not this, you know, in-depth process by any means, but I'm constantly trying to just cross-reference with unique sources as much as possible, and off the beaten path sources as much as possible, where, you know, I want to make sure I'm looking at journal articles. I want to make sure I'm looking at investor documents and financial stuff. I want to make sure I'm looking at Google Trends or Google Patents. I use quite frequently as well too, to try and tie stuff in. And so I'm just I don't want to necessarily, you know, I think first principles gets used too often, and I wouldn't say I do that well enough, but, you know, I don't want to go use necessarily somebody else's written article. I want to go try to find the source and the core of it, and then try to pull that in and provide my lens as much as possible. But that's kind of that.
Yeah, it almost strikes me as like curating versus
that's a good way to put it.
Developing entirely like new ideas. Like it's neat because I can tell you've read a ton. Like when you read your article, it's like, oh, Shane's definitely been on the ground doing this.
Yeah, it's curation is a good way to put it, or like a because I don't think I've ever had an original idea in my life. I just try to really synthesize a bunch of things together and make that into something that is, if not unique, it's not as mainstream, if that makes sense. So
yeah, it's definitely a diverse bunch of sources. Well, I think we covered most of what I was going to chat with you about the research and writing process. So I'm going to hand the mic back over to Rhishi.
Cool. Thanks, DJ.
Hey, thanks, DJ. Hey, Shane, this has been so fascinating so far. And you had mentioned Matt, and I just want to do a shout out to a podcast episode Matt Kaus did with Invest Like the Best. It's about John Deere's history. It's a really cool episode that, you know, if you are in this space, you should listen to. And it's on one of the best podcasts out there. You know, Shane, I want to dig into some of the time that you've spent working at different companies, right? And you're writing at the same time. And, you know, now it has become much more acceptable that you write while you work at a certain place. And when you work somewhere, you know, you're working on projects, and if you're writing in the same space, there's always a risk of conflict of interest, revealing something that you shouldn't. Like, how have you managed that process?
Yeah, it's interesting. I ironically, Rhishi, I find it actually more challenging now than I did before, and I'll explain why. Is before I was kind of focused in on one specific area. So my most previous employer was in the digital ag space, which is pretty broad still, of course, but I kind of knew there was, you know, a couple things that I was working on, and I just tried to stay away from that. Although there's still some conflicts, just in the sense of this organization also had customers that were in a space that I would talk about. So there's definitely some issues or challenges there, of course. But again, I try to keep things relatively neutral. But I'll touch on why I think it's more challenging now. Is I had kind of that one area that I was focused on now, whereas now I have clients and companies and multiple NDAs that I'm under at any given time. And it's been probably more challenging, and quite frankly, there's been, in some ways, it's taken away from Upstream, because I try to be as cognizant as I can of where am I brushing up against things, and I'm not naive enough to think that stuff doesn't, you know, mesh and meld around in your brain. I know that that's the case, but what I've tried to do is just take as good a notes as I can around what is talked about on the call, but then also making sure that I'm writing about stuff that hasn't came up yet, and I put that into Upstream or somewhere public, because I can say, hey, look, like I've already talked about this. And so that's kind of the one way I've done it. But I think in terms of trying to manage it just, you know, right now I'm working with I'll stay away from the name of the company and the technology and everything, but it's a very prominent technology that comes up in agriculture, and I've actually written about it extensively in the past. And now when news comes up about it, I want to dive into it, but I just I hold back because it's just, my credibility and that people can trust me is more important than trying to have that one incremental idea that I put in there. And so I try to just steer clear when things do get right directly in line with that, but with a topic or a company or what have you. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. And even I mentioned how I want to make sure I take really good notes, and how I want to make sure that I put stuff into Upstream before it ever could come up. And so I'll give you an example. This wasn't actually a company I had an NDA with, and it wasn't actually anything major. I actually had a call with this organization, this is probably a year ago, and they used a term that I thought was pretty general. In general, like used in the industry and other industries, quite frankly, and they were talking about it as, hey, this is our core focus as an organization. And a couple of weeks later, I used that term within Upstream, just not related to them, just within a different area of agriculture. And the CEO reached out to me and is like, hey, Shane, like, you should give us some credit when you're using our term. And I was like, oh man, like, I've talked about this numerous times. Like, I didn't actually get this from you. And so I had to go back to my Shane Agronomy blogs and show like, hey, like, I've used this term. I used this term in 2018. I used this term in 2019, and I used it here just to reinforce. And the individual was like, oh, okay, fair enough. But, I think you would have benefited from inputting our organization within that conversation. But I think that's just reinforced that need to be putting stuff in writing where possible. And again, trying to be aware of what comes up on a call or in a conversation or in an email, and then making sure that's steered clear of when writing. But I don't have a real focused approach outside of just try to make sure that I'm on top of everything.
Yeah, maybe they should have given you credit instead of the other way around, right? So
well, I don't claim to have made up I didn't make up the term either. I got it from some other outside of agriculture article that I pulled in. So
you talked about trust and credibility, and I think that is such an important thing. And that I think all writers, doesn't matter whether they write online or not, have to think about. And you mentioned this persona, Doug, somewhere in the Midwest. So I'm curious, like, sometimes when you write about topics, some of them can be complicated and intricate topics. And, do you ever feel that maybe this might be difficult for Doug and I need to dumb it down a little bit? And what is it that going to do to the trust and credibility that I have with my reader group?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rhishi, and it's something I struggle with a lot, quite frankly, just because there's even people that are smart, but maybe they're not constant readers of Upstream, and so I might have referenced it 3 times in the past, but they might not have read those specific articles. And so do I go back and highlight the basics of whatever, say MRV or something along those lines, or measurement verification and reporting and those sorts of things? Or do I just kind of use that acronym and keep going? And at this point, I think this stemmed from a conversation with my friend Matt, who I alluded to earlier. And he's like, write for the person that is going to be the best sort of reader, and that's going to level up your take. And so I have to, so sometimes I make the call to assume that this is a person that understands this complex topic or intricate topic, instead of writing more extensively on it. And I go back and forth on that sometimes too, because sometimes it's tech related, sometimes it's agronomy, and I struggle with the specifics of how deep into the fundamentals do I go, and how do I actually turn this into something a little more basic for them. And I know for me, just because I sometimes don't understand it either, my goal is to try and bring metaphors in as much as possible from health or from website creation or something that is generally a little bit better understood, and try to apply that to complex biology in the soil, or this week with the Azure and Bayer announcement, how do you tie that back into something that's typical in website development today? And so I kind of try to bring in metaphors to make it easier and relative, but yeah, I don't have a good answer for you on that, Rhishi. It's just super challenging for me to manage it week in and week out.
I think this writing for a persona is such an important lesson that I think all writers need to think about and learn from it. So I'm glad that you are bringing that up and talking about it.
Yeah.
And
well, and I think, oh, sorry, Rhishi.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I subscribe to a ton of newsletters, and like, I'm kind of like, my inbox is kind of like a newsletter slut. Sorry for the inappropriate term, but that's kind of how I think about it. I just want information in, and the ones that the newsletters that I value the most are the ones that I open up and I know what I'm getting. And sometimes that is that they're talking about random things, but some where I signed up thinking I was going to get content on, marketing, growth marketing strategies, and then all of a sudden they're talking about, something or with DAOs or something that is unrelated to marketing in general, and I'm like, well, you know what, I don't know if I want to open this up anymore, because is it going to be something I value? Is it going to be what I want? If I wanted to learn about DAOs, I would go and subscribe to a newsletter about that. And so the goal is just like, how can you consistently deliver what people are expecting? And I think without a persona, it can get challenging because of the topics in ag, of course, being so diverse. And, I don't want people opening up Upstream and being like, well, now he's talking about vertical farming, and I just don't care about vertical farming. And so that's kind of my approach anyways.
Yeah, to build on that a little bit, right? So I'm sure, and I notice it in your writing, you also have evolved as a writer and a thinker, and all of us do over the last, 10 years, right? And so how you approach things and how you write about things is changing. And so do you believe that sort of you have confidence that your audience will come along with that journey? Because, my expectations were here, but then have moved somewhere else because you've evolved. How do you manage that process?
Yeah, I think in terms of, like, it's interesting you bring that up, and I have kind of adapted things to your point, like the subjects I talk on. I used to target initially I kind of thought about a Canadian audience, whereas I've adapted that to be more US based, because that's where my readership tends to come from, or international. But I think the biggest thing is in terms of kind of evolving that approach. I trust that I'm going to be writing about stuff that is relevant to the industry and relevant to Doug, or relevant to the audience in general. And so even when I start to, one thing that I try to do is when I start to push things outside of where I would normally go, I try to tie that back into or contextualize it in the sense that, hey, you know what, I know we're not quite there yet, but here's why this is interesting, and what this might, and this could mean something in 2025, or this could mean something over the next couple of years, because XYZ company is looking at it, that is a major player in the industry. And so I try to bring it back to, well, here's why you should be pushing towards that next level. And so just kind of trying to give these little crumbs of reasoning that would encourage people to be interested and open to reading about something that maybe isn't their core area or focus right now. Specifically, as I look at where I talked a little bit more about crop input or crop protection active ingredients and stuff, you go back a year and a half, whereas now I've kind of crept away, because I noticed people were like, hey, you know what, Shane talks about ag technology more specifically, and more about the intersection of tech. And so I started to say, okay, well, I'm going to lean into that and kind of pull that along a little bit further. So that's kind of the way I would think about that. Yeah,
so this is really fascinating. So you are making some conscious and subconscious choices of what to include, what to write about. And as DJ was talking about earlier, curation is a big part of that. So I want to get into this audience question, which is like, how much of what you want to write makes into Upstream, and how much is left on the cutting floor for that day or for the future, right?
Yeah, I have, oh man, I should count. I don't even want to know how many different topics I have that I want to touch on. And I think there would be hundreds literally in my list of things I want to talk about. And what I've realized is that I initially thought some of them would be valuable for a specific standalone into some news event or some specific standalone article. But I've also come to realize that I need to pull some of those just as one paragraph within a specific write-up that I'm doing. And so a lot of it does end up on the cutting floor. And quite frankly, I use Substack, of course, as you know, Rhishi and DJ is, they have a limit in terms of, you have too big of an email that can't go out. And so that tends to keep me from sharing, I would say probably at least handful of different links or extra pieces of writing every single week. So there's quite a bit, and I think in a way that makes it Upstream better, because I can get long-winded real fast and overly excessive, because again, that's part of why I like the persona, because for me, I would probably share 100 links a week if it wasn't for that limit, and for trying to focus in on this persona. Because if I purely did what I would be interested in, it would probably just be a never-ending link email, because I just, like I said, I have like information anxiety. I just want information constantly, but people aren't like that. I think people get anxious having a long email that they can't get to, but they want to read it. And so there's this trade-off, of course, that I have to be cognizant of and thinking about constantly.
Yeah, Shane, I'm going to jump in real quick, but how do you gain insights about your audience, and how much information is provided by Substack about your audience behavior and what they read and don't read?
Yeah, it's so the only way I've really done it is I did a survey. I've done a couple surveys in the past. One was specific to, what do you do? What sort of company do you work for? Your country and gender and these sorts of things, to glean a little bit of insight. And that was probably the core survey where I have got the most information. I did a second one, just kind of building on that, and then looking at potential monetization strategies and what people would be open to, which gained me a little bit more insight into how people think about Upstream within their career, in their personal life, and these sorts of things. But Substack, I mean, to be perfectly blunt, it sucks for getting insight about your reader, and just in general, it's a free platform that gets you started very seamlessly. I love Substack for that. I think right now I'm actually looking at and working with an agency to actually build out a website that is my own, that can also have some more customized aspects to it, because it's just, quite frankly, there's not a lot of insight, and I don't sit here and think, hey, there's so much data that I could have that would just, disproportionately influence what I know about the industry. But I would like to get better understanding of who's clicking what, how often are they clicking, what topics are getting people in this specific geography. I mean, you probably can tell from Upstream, I'm pretty analytical. And so I love data and I love information. And one of the things that I did, this is maybe a story that's kind of adjacent, but when you look at Upstream, what it does, you're not Upstream, Substack, what it does give you is like your traffic every day. So you kind of can see it go up or down. And for me, just because I release on Sunday, it spikes up from Sunday, Monday, and then it just kind of trickles down and then spikes. And so what I did was I used that to say, okay, well, I'm sharing this really long newsletter. What if I broke out parts of this that'd be its own separate article that I could then reshare on social media at different points that drives traffic at different times? And so I got that out of Substack, and then leveraged that to change some of the way I approach the content delivery and how I leverage social media within that. And so there's some insights that you can derive that change how things move and progress, but really it's, clicks, opens, and views, and even that is sketchy at best. For anybody that's on Substack would know that it's definitely not ideal.
Yeah, I think Shane is Canadian, so he was very nice when he said that Substack sucks. Their analytics sucks. Substack I love, but their analytics sucks. That's a nice way to put it, I should say.
Yeah.
You talked about Twitter and Substack and growing your audience and reach. And you specifically mentioned a particular tactic, like how can I break this up so that I can fill in those sort of low points during the week. Could you talk about any more other strategies that you followed to grow your audience or increase the stickiness of your audience? Because there's always churn that you see with any audience.
Yeah, I've done a lot of, I kind of view audience growth as like a game. So it's kind of fun for me to play around. And so I have I've kind of used it as just like, I think of this one framework that I always think of is like, how can I stack the deck in my favor? And I've come to realize that you're not always going to have this one big rock that you can put on that's going to stack the deck in your favor over here. It's all these little things. And so I kind of look at it like, how many feathers can I stack up that are going to drive traffic? And so, I'll stick with Twitter for a second. And so I share Twitter, via Twitter, Upstream via Twitter every single week. And because of what I was active for a decade or more now with Twitter, I have a decent following on there, so that helps drive it. But then what I did is I created a Upstream Ag Insights specific Twitter so that I could then reshare the newsletter again via a different handle, via a different day, use it to help engagement by liking the original tweet I send out. And so there's these little things there that I've done from a Twitter perspective. Same with LinkedIn. I share it on LinkedIn consistently every single day, or sorry, every single week. I used to do YouTube actually, where I would kind of summarize my 3 favorite things. That just was more of a I shouldn't say a pain. It just took a little bit more time. Like, it would only be a 10-minute video, but then I'd spend time thinking, okay, how do I want to talk about this? What is it going to be? And so all of a sudden, by the time I then uploaded it and shared it, it was 2+ hours of just trying to get this 10-minute video up. And so I actually like that. And I think I got a lot of good feedback on that. And I still get requests for more audio and video, but I haven't prioritized that anymore. I think what are maybe the more interesting ones are LinkedIn in terms of, so when I started, I don't even want to know how many custom messages I sent, but I went and just sent custom messages to every single influential agriculture person I could think of. I didn't just copy and paste the same message. I mean, there was of course parts that were consistent, but I went and looked at their profile and read why, or put why I thought it was going to be beneficial to them. And so I must have sent 300 or 400 messages that way. And I kind of think about messaging and people, like kind of how COVID and R naughts are just diseases and the R naught number. And so I kind of am like, okay, well, you know, not every person is going to share it with 20 people or 10 or even 3, but if each person shares it with 2, that starts to compound pretty hard over time. And so I've kind of looked at it from that perspective. And so I've spent hours doing that. Also did the same with, you know, if you go on the digital platforms now with those conferences, I've actually I did the same thing where, as LinkedIn, where I would go and send messages to everybody, hey, I think this might be interesting to you. And so spent hours doing that. Also had a friend that was, he's pretty into technology. And so he helped me with the automation of doing some of these sorts of things via LinkedIn, via those tools. And so that helped out a little bit as well. And then right now I'm also looking at advertising via LinkedIn. And so I'm like, okay, I've never actually spent any money on growing the audience, but I'm looking at how can I learn about digital marketing and grow the audience with a small budget that's not very large, but looking at using some of these phantom buster tools and all these things out there to try and grow it and get into more people's line of sight, so to speak, or within their feed or message. I think the other thing would be, I sent messages to every single ag specific university I could think of as well too, which they're a little bit outside my core focus. And so I was a little bit hesitant to do that because I wanted the dean to share it with the you know, year 4 or 4th year students was kind of the message I sent. And I got some subscribers from that, and they'd be a little bit outside, but my hope was that, hey, you know what, it's individuals that are, again, ambitious, want to be understanding what's happening in the industry. And so did that. There's been collaboration with other groups. So Tenacious Ventures or AgThentic, I did a report with them and have done some podcasts with them. Ag Funder, another influential ag media organization, did a report with them on farm technology. Real Agriculture, a company up here in Canada, you know, coming onto their podcast and video to try and give updates. And so just kind of positioning myself in those areas to be heard and looked at in that regard. But you know, beyond that, that's kind of the core. I think the biggest thing, if I had to just summarize what it comes down to, is just the consistency thing. I think you alluded to it earlier, Rhishi, where I want people to be like, I know that on Sunday I'm going to get Upstream in my inbox, and I want people to say, you know what, there's going to be at least one thing I can learn or take away. I don't expect people to read all 10 pieces. I don't expect people to click on every single link, but I hope that people consistently are wanting to open Upstream, and then they go in and they click something that they like, or they pull something that they like, or it starts a conversation that they want to have with their colleague or friend or whoever. And I think that's been probably the biggest. I mean, at the end of the day, if you can't do that, I don't know how many you can send all the Twitter messages and Google ads and LinkedIn ads you want, but you won't grow. And so I think just the consistency and quality has been the biggest biggest focus for me, and something that is hopefully going to be the focus moving forward.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I mean, I more than 100% agree with you that consistency and quality is the first thing that every writer should focus on. That's your bread and butter. Because if you don't have that, everything else is, you're just wasting money, right? At that part and time.
Yeah, it's kind of like, sorry to cut you off there, Rhishi. I just, we talk, and you would talk about this a lot too, like product market fit and all these different things. And even though it's just an email newsletter, I just think about it like, what is is there a fit for this? And is it going to resonate with the target Doug or Donna's or whoever you want to think about within that persona? And so I think that's kind of the core focus is having that email market fit, I guess, or something along those lines.
No, it's a product, right? It's a product that somebody has subscribed to and has given you permission to be in their inbox. So it's absolutely a product with some expectations. And you talked about how people have expectations and you try very hard to meet them consistently week after week. And I think the other thing I'm picking up from your previous discussion is, I think don't be afraid to try different things, right? You just rattled off like 15 different ideas that you tried. There's no one thing that is going to work and give you all the results that you want. You have to consistently try while being focused on the writing and the quality, right? I think that is such an important message for all writers.
I agree. And I think the patience within that is so key too. And even like to tie back into some of those LinkedIn messages, like I sent messages to a lot of these individuals that they didn't subscribe right off. They didn't even respond to me right off the hop. And I can think of dozens literally now that have reached out to me being like, hey, you know what? This is 6 months later, a year later, and have been like, hey, how can we be involved with Upstream? But they didn't take the time to even read it at the time. And I don't hold that against them. I'm not saying that because, hey, look how silly they are. I just mean people, it takes time to grow a brand. It takes time to trust you, to share it all the way around. And once people hear things, like I can't remember the number, like, what is it? People need to see something 10 or 12 times or 15, whatever the high number is, before they start to say, hey, you know what, I recognize that, I know what that is, and maybe I should dig a little bit more into it. And so I think just being patient and trusting that if you are, to your point, Rhishi, sharing high quality content consistently, over time, you're going to start to see that target audience be drawn into your newsletter, your writing, or your brand, whatever that is.
Yeah. No, that's so true. I want to switch, I know we have a few minutes left here, into some of the monetization aspects of Upstream. And I also want to weave in one of the questions here on the Q&A. And you have decided to go down an advertising route, not a subscription route. And there are pros and cons of both sides, both approaches. Could you talk about that decision-making process?
Yeah, and it's funny because the decision, I talk about strategy all the time, and the decision-making process at the time was, I have no other income coming in and someone wants to give me money to advertise, I'm going to try it out. That was literally a year ago. I literally had, it was like, I don't even know, on a CPM basis, I'm like, I don't even know if I can charge anything reasonable for this. I had no clue, but the individual wanted to support Upstream. So I'm extremely appreciative of that, and just kind of stuck with that because I think about, I struggle with it all the time because there's of course the bias that can come in. There's the reader. I want to be respectful of readers first and foremost. I have people that want to pay me to blast out new emails to my readership, and I don't want to be in that position. I don't want to disrespect my readership by sending out these random emails. And so I do struggle a little bit with even having the ad in there, but I'm hyper cognizant again of who is in there, and I've turned down sponsors because I didn't think that it was an organization, not anything against them. I just was like, I don't think this is a fit with my audience. And so I think, some people are like, well, we really want to reach agronomists and farmers. And I'm like, that's not who my audience really is. And like, well, we still want to support it so we can share Upstream. And I'm like, but that's not going to resonate with my audience and it's going to look bad on me. And so I try to pull that back. The way I think about versus going to the paid route and is, I think there's a couple things where the conversion, I have a decent amount of subscribers now, but even if I got 6%, 5% conversion, the amount of dollars after the Substack take rate and Stripe, all those, it's like, oh man, it's not even it's not that valuable, and I want to focus on still growing it and reaching more people, because I view the primary driver of revenue for Upstream is actually the consulting and advisory aspect that I can talk about in a second. But really, I prioritize it because I can make a little bit of dollars off of the newsletter now, or why I've kept the advertising is because I can make a little bit of dollars off of it for the upstream business that I have, and it can still grow. I'm not putting anything behind a paywall. I'm upfront with my sponsors too, being like, you know what, if something comes up where I'm still gonna analyze your business, and I'm going to call out the things that I don't think are that great, or I'm gonna still highlight your competitors, and it's gonna could show up potentially right below your advertisement, just so you know. And so they've all been perfectly fine with that, and they've even said, hey, you know what, that's why we still want to be associated with you, because you're trying to take a neutral road. And again, I don't claim that. I mean, I know I have biases. I do my best to avoid them, but they're there. So that's kind of been the core focus there. And because of me monetizing more, like 85% of my income or more would be from the consulting and advisory aspect that I do. And so making sure that Upstream can be shared more readily, more open to more people, helps me get more leads in, more conversations with interesting people, helps my network. And I think that compounds over time. So that's kind of been the logic to this point anyways. I've looked at, or I am looking at, can I actually create an enterprise level approach where there's actually deeper reporting, more, I would say even platform-based stuff within an Upstream paywall, but that's still, I would say, in the ideation phase at this point.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about conflict of interest, but I think you kind of addressed that. There's a question here from the audience about expectations from your consulting clients, right? How are they different or similar to what you write about versus what type of analysis they expect from you from a consulting standpoint?
Yeah, I think the interesting part is within Upstream, like, quite frankly, I don't really hold anything back most of the time. Like, I'm not trying to keep a little bit extra. And so what it does though is I use that as like a motivator, because I'm like, if I'm giving everything away, I have to go out and learn something new, not just every day, but multiple things every single hour to really be able to provide value to the organizations. And so a lot of it is just really, they want something more specific to them, is probably the easiest way to summarize it, where, you know, maybe I'm talking about let's say see and spray technology or something like that. You know, a company might say, okay, well, you know what, we read that and we really like it. You kind of had a broad approach to it, but let's think about, how is that going to impact our business? How is that going to impact our customers? How is it going to impact our products? How should our staff be thinking about that? And then how can you actually build out an approach for us around getting that into the staff, training the staff, benefiting them. And so it really just gets to a more deeper level of specificity, I guess, is probably the easiest way to sum that up.
Very cool. I know we're getting up against time, so maybe last one or two questions, more generic questions. You know, newsletter writing, because of tools like Substack and all that, has really taken off in the last 2 years, right? It's almost like, if you don't have a newsletter, what are you doing, kind of thing. And so with any type of content or any product, right, there's always, you know, initially there's this sort of a huge jump in number of people who will do it, and then there'll be few who will survive because they are consistent. They want to deliver a quality product every week. Like, what advice do you have for, you know, people who are thinking about starting a newsletter, or maybe even just writing online? As of today, 2021.
Yeah, great question. And I think I think if you view it as just like this short-term way to make money or have thousands of people to talk to, you're in it for the wrong reason, quite frankly. I think you have to tie it to, you know, the person you want to be in the future, in some ways, where it's like, I want to be a person with a massive network of people that I can go to for any question, for an answer, or that I can just learn from it. And so I think if you tie it back to who you want to be in the future, and not just a year from now, but 10 years out, and extend your time horizon, I think that's a pretty good motivator for anybody that is going to be serious about it. Because you know, I even think about myself. I've been writing for a long time, and I look at how much I've progressed, even just in terms of upping my consistency to every single week, and what that's done for my learning, for my network, just for even how I think on a day-to-day basis, and it just compounds so hard. So I think just extending out your time horizon and tying in, you know, who you want to become, and the type of person you want to be in the future, and how can writing really support that. And I know for myself, I don't even want to know where I'd be in my career if I didn't start writing. Like it's been the foundation, or the catalyst, that is maybe a better way of putting it, for every single new opportunity I've gained, every single person in my network, and just for how I think and approach things. So I'm super thankful that I got started into it.
Well, we're at time. So Shane, thank you so much for your time. I think all of us learned quite a bit and got a behind the scenes look at your process. And thank you everyone who joined. This will be released in the next couple of days as a podcast episode. I'll send the link out. And Shane, say hi to Doug from us.
I will, yeah, and thanks for having me. I really, I always talk about the ag tech and all these sorts of things, but super fun to talk about writing, because obviously it's been super influential on me, and happy to meet a bunch of new people like yourself, DJ, and looking forward to staying in touch with you guys in the future.
All right, everyone, have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye.